Excellent. Well, it looks like we've just succeeded in emptying the lobby, which means that there should be a good number of people now in to join us for this afternoon's webinar, which is about an independent evaluation and review of 20-mile-an-hour limits in Faversham and Tonbridge in Kent. So very warm welcome to those of you who've joined us. I'm sure there will be other colleagues coming in so far. We had nearly 200 registrations for this afternoon's webinar, which is fantastic. And I think just demonstrates the level of interest that there is in this topic area. So hopefully we're in for a treat, both in terms of the presentation content and also in terms of some of the Q&A and discussion time that we will have at the end of our webinar this afternoon. If you're new to one of our webinars, just to let you know that we do really want to encourage ongoing discussion and engagement. So if you use the chat function, I'm sure most of you are very familiar with chat in Microsoft Teams now. But if you've got a specific question that you want to ask of our presenters and panelists, then it would just be really helpful if you put the word question. You can even stick it in capitals. Go on, treat yourself at the start. So you've got question, then what your question is. It will help me as I seek to chair the discussion time at the end of the session to make sure that I identify the ones. And Steve has very helpfully put into the chat already how to lay out your questions so that they're easily recognisable. So this afternoon, we're joined by Jamie Watson from Kent County Council, who will be presenting some of Kent's perspective on the trials that they ran. And then also joined by two of my colleagues, Momina Kamran and Scott, who are going to be presenting some of the findings from the analysis that we undertook. But just before we do that, I just wanted to create a little bit in the way of context for this afternoon. Oh, sorry, before I do that, just to say this is the last one of this series that we've been doing through the months of June. And just seeing the people who are gathered in the lobby at the moment, I can see that a number of you are familiar faces who've been around a number of our webinars. But if they're new to you, then it might be worth you going back and checking up some of the other content from the last few weeks. So we've done webinars on rural speeds last week, ethnicity and road safety a couple of weeks ago, and one on safety performance indicators. And all of those are available on demand if you go to agilysys.co.uk/webinars. So some context then for our time this afternoon. Obviously, there's been a great deal of interest in 20-mile-an-hour limits as long as I can remember in my time in road safety, and that's now turning out to be quite a long time. I think particularly initially because the recognition that reducing speed limits to 20 miles an hour can reduce the harm caused in case of a conflict with a vehicle. But as time has gone on, I think we've seen, particularly through organisations like 20's Plenty, you'll probably hear referenced on several occasions in our time together today, the recognition that 20-mile-an-hour limits deliver a wide range of co-benefits. It's not just the harm reduction specifically from crashes, but it's about some of the wider benefits that 20's introduce. But just to sort of look at what the evidence says, so I'm sure there will be those who are familiar with Ramborg's work on collision speed and fatality risk, and you see that this is marked out in kilometers an hour rather than miles an hour, but as soon as you get to 30 kmh or around 20 miles an hour, then the fatality risk in a crash between a vehicle and a pedestrian starts to increase rapidly. So there is definitely an argument around the safety aspects of those. And it's not just a peculiarly British obsession. I think globally, the road safety community recognizing that 20 miles an hour and 30 kilometers an hour are really meaningful in terms of addressing the global epidemic of road traffic injury. So the global UN Decade of Action Global Plan, which was launched last year, has speed management very much at the heart of it in terms of how we move forward in addressing road safety risk. That was backed up with the global decade of Global Road Safety Week, which happened last year, where Love 20 was the theme. focused on Streets for Life and making sure that roads are safe where people live and move and work. And it's really a kind of fundamental brand of safe system thinking to ensure that we have limits that are appropriate to the way in which roads are used, and where there is likely to be conflict between vulnerable road users, particularly those walking and cycling, and vehicles, then speed is the thing that really makes the difference in terms of the transference of kinetic energy, making sure that people don't sustain serious injury. And it's finding its way into UK public policy. So some of you will be familiar with Gear Change, which is the government's strategy on improving cycling and walking, which was launched in July 2020, which set out that sort of national vision for investment in walking and cycling, where a number of those co-benefits are articulated, not least in the Prime Minister's own forward to that document. And myself and a number of other colleagues seeking to help government with the development of their new strategic framework, which we are expecting to see come out in the next few weeks, also made sure that there was a very clear call in there for government to prioritise 20 miles an hour where people live and move as one of the things that they could do to ensure safer roads. So there's a sort of very much a kind of policy focus on this at the moment, nationally and internationally, for safety reasons, but also because of the value in terms of active travel and those sorts of things. And I think that's probably why we've got so much interest in our time together this afternoon. I think that's also afforded a little bit of time for people to get through the lobby and to join us. So it means that now Jamie's got a well-attended audience to focus on what he's got to say, and to present some of the work that Kent have been doing, and why we got involved in terms of evaluating it. So Jamie, over to you.
Thank you. So way of introduction, I'm the Senior Programme Manager in Kent County Council, and also heading up the active travel element of the highways in Road Safety and Active Travel Group. I thought what I'd first of all do is just to give you a slide on the setup in Kent. Kent is a very large, mainly rural county made up of 12 districts and a unitary authority. And I'm going to be talking about the trials of Faversham and Tonbridge towns within Kent, and I've highlighted those as red dots. To give you a bit of background to the trial, I've highlighted on the slides here the two towns, Faversham on the left and Tonbridge on the right-hand side. Kent County Council was awarded 1.6 million from the Department for Transport Emergency Active Travel Fund to invest in walking and cycling initiatives. This was a response to the COVID-19 pandemic and the social distancing restrictions that were in place, which reduced the capacity of public transport and sought to promote more active travel. Demand for cycling has been growing nationally, and there's been an increased demand across the county for area-wide 20-mile-per-hour schemes. In response to this opportunity, a decision was made by the KCC Cabinet Member for Highways and Transportation to progress an East Kent and a West Kent town-wide trial. The project would enable KCC to assess how these schemes work for large-scale areas before similar schemes are considered elsewhere. Tonbridge and Faversham Town were chosen as the trial areas. Due to the emergency nature of the fund, the Department for Transport informed all highway authorities that works must be started within 4 weeks of providing the funding, and then completed within 8 weeks, which meant a go-live date for the trial needed to be in place by mid-September 2020. This was particularly challenging and took place during the height of the pandemic. The short period only allow a trial using signing and road markings, no traffic calming at all. KCC had reviewed its 20-mile-per-hour policy in May 2019, which allowed average speeds between 24 and 28 miles an hour to be implemented as a 20-mile-per-hour scheme, but using only light touches and innovative ideas such as removal of centre lines, use of planters instead of build outs, changing street parking layouts. Anything over 28 miles an hour was deemed to require additional traffic calming measures other than purely signing and lining. And that's important to understand. We had a very limited time to put all of this out. It's also important to, at this stage, to highlight the differences in the two towns chosen, and then the amount of work that had taken place, particularly in Faversham, prior to KCC receiving the funding. Faversham is a market town which is expanding quickly, but only has 2 A roads running through it, the A2 and the A251. Tonbridge is larger and has 5 A roads. Faversham has a town council which had worked closely with 20's Plenty Faversham, who were instrumental in bringing the 20 speed limit to the forefront and campaigned for many years prior to the funding being available. And the changes in direction to more of an active travel approach also has helped on the political side of things. Faversham Town Council had employed Phil Jones Associates to develop the scheme, along with additional advice and assistance from 20's Plenty, particularly Adrian Berent. Faversham Town Council were also keen on developing their LC whip and saw the 20-mile-per-hour speed limit as integral to this. Tonbridge at the time were also developing an active travel strategy, or LC whip, but much less work has been undertaken on the town-wide 20, although it had been talked about for several years, and small elements of Tonbridge already had 20-mile-per-hour zones, as did Faversham. Now, KCC commissioned Project Centre to design the 20-mile-per-hour zone in Tonbridge. The aims and objectives, we need to be absolutely sure what the objectives were. So the scheme objectives were to encourage more active travel journeys, obviously. Importantly, to complete all the works, the signage, the line, the build outs, the gateways, and spend the emergency active travel fund allocation within the extremely tight time constraints. And very importantly, in KCC's mind, is to deliver a communications campaign working with the local partners to support this scheme implementation and the experimental order consultation, to raise awareness, embed this scheme and help make it a success. Also, long-term aspirations are to create a safer, healthier and cleaner environment for the residents and businesses of the two towns. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the communications campaign because, in my view, this is key to a successful implementation of a 20-mile-per-hour limit or zone. The communications campaign needed to raise awareness of the scheme and its objectives in order to understand whether we were getting to the public. Now, we measured this. By click rates of posts on social media accounts, click rates on our websites, feedback collected from feedback forms and surveys, comments on social media platforms, just general media coverage, and response level to the public consultation. Along with the communications package, the education was deemed important element to increase knowledge about the benefits of the scheme, to create buy-in and support for it. And this would help to understand why 20 is important and how they can change their driving habits. It would explain the benefits by specific messaging to motorists, cyclists, pedestrians and residents. And we thought it necessary to explain the special circumstances that allow this to happen quickly and irrelevant of any other active travel measures. And we wanted to encourage empathy and responsibility among all road users. In addition, in order to judge the success of this scheme, we undertook attitudinal surveys. So we did these pre-installation, mid and post-implementation. This measures resident support and acceptance of the 20-mile-an-hour limits and increase their knowledge of the benefits of the 20 opposed to a 30-mile-per-hour limit. Feedback was also collected from feedback forms and surveys, and we regularly looked at comments on the social media. We undertook pedestrian and cycle counts before and post implementation. We also looked at the crash collision history, 3, 5 and 10 years the locations and severity and likely causation factors. And of course, we looked at the average speeds and level of traffic surveys undertaken pre and post. And we also used the ESRI UK average speed data to model traffic travel times at various locations, and used a combination of fixed cameras and metro count loops. We in this instance, we used the Vivacity cameras. The stages now, just highlighted the stages on this slide. We had design, consultation, implementation, monitoring, and then report and recommendations. As stated earlier in the designs for the two towns, we undertook the designs using consultants. Because of the need to introduce these measures quickly due to the funding constraints, an experimental traffic order was used, which allowed the scheme to be implemented and then followed by a 6-month consultation period. The consultation included newsletters, which you can see at the format on the slide, road safety campaigns, as I said before, social media messaging, and a working group was set up with Faversham Town Council and Tonbridge and Malling Borough Council to agree those messaging and the campaigns to highlight to the residents and businesses that the consultation was taking place on the trial. On completion of the consultation period, which was 6 months, we then commissioned the analysis of the responses, as well as interrogating the data collected. A project centre undertook the consultation analysis. Faversham Town Council also ran a consultation of their own, which was included in the final document, but as an appendix. Now, I think that's probably over to my bit for now. Back over to Sam.
Great, thanks, Jamie. Yeah, so Sam and Momina are now going to take control and pick up with a presentation about some of the findings from the evaluation. So Sam, over to you.
Thank you, Dan and Jamie, for that. And yes, just before we get started on that, myself and the rest of the team just want to reiterate our excitement in supporting this type of evaluation project, and indeed presenting findings which we always enjoy supporting and engaging with. And so following that introduction, as I say, myself and Momina are going to give an overview of the main qualitative and quantitative findings. We will also cover some wider considerations which will help us to understand these findings in context before finally moving on to recommendations, some of which are relevant for 20 miles per hour side-only limits and zones on urban roads in general. And so firstly, what data did we actually use? And so for the purposes of quantitative impact assessment, we analysed 3 types of data to assess the effectiveness of the 2 trials in a comparative manner. And so firstly, we took data from automatic traffic counters, otherwise known as spot speed sites. We had a total of 13 in Faversham and a total of 12 ATC sites in Tonbridge. Secondly, we looked at road user count data and traffic count data generated from Vivacity AI sensors, but also a commission count from PMRS. And then the third data source that we looked at was in-vehicle telematics, both to assess average speed differences, but also the level of compliance 12 months post-implementation across the local road networks of both towns. And again, the in-vehicle telematics is broadly the same type of output that we have for our speed compliance tool, where we essentially combine telematics tracks from Ordnance Survey's high-speed network with speed limit data. And so before we move on to the findings themselves, I'm just going to quickly talk about the data parameters, which is important for understanding the applicability of the data and what we can actually say from the data itself. And so just thinking about the baselines from the traffic counters, in Faversham, the first speed survey was commissioned in September 2017, covering 1 week, which was the baseline for Faversham. And then the second survey was in July 2021, which was the second survey for Faversham. So you've got that 4-year difference there. Whereas in Tonbridge, the first speed survey covered 1 week in July, August 2020, which corresponds with the commencement of the trial date itself. But then again, as with Faversham, the second count was in July 2021, and therefore we could compare the level of compliance 12 months post implementation. And secondly, just thinking about the ways in which the timeframes aligned from the road user counts, the Vivacity site ran from 8 months from January to July in 2021, whereas the PMRS counts were issued in 4 separate speed surveys, starting in June 2020, so one month before the commencement of the trials, and again with the last counts running right up until May, June 2021. And so now, and so lastly, yes, and so just in terms of the telematics timeframes, thinking about that general compliance, we essentially had 2 years worth of data, which allowed us to look at average speed difference, but then also that general level of compliance. And so despite the different timeframes and baselines, it means that direct comparisons can sometimes be hard with this type of data, but particularly when you view the ATC data and the telematics data separately, there are many positive indications of increased compliance and speed reductions as a result of the 2 town-wide trials. And again, in this instance, there was insufficient post-time trial to analyse collision data and comment on safety improvements specifically. And so firstly, if we just take a look at, so this map shows for Faversham, and we have a corresponding one for Tonbridge. This map essentially shows the changes between the average speeds between 2 years. So you've got from April 2019 up until March 2020, and then the difference of that time period, so that was pre-trial, to the post-implementation, so April 2020 to March 2021. So again, with that post-trial period, there is 8 months of post-implementation that we can assess there. And so firstly, looking at the changes for Faversham from the previous year, most roads saw reductions of up to 5 miles per hour, with a few having even higher reductions in average speeds. And a minority of roads saw increases in average speeds, although it's important to stress that the majority of these were by less than 5 miles per hour. Looking at the picture for Tonbridge, as with Faversham, many roads actually saw reductions in average speeds of up to 5 miles per hour. But this was more common in the north, where previously there were actually fewer limits in place in Tonbridge. And so secondly, the next 2 telematics maps just look at that second post-implementation phase that I alluded to, so that year from March 2020 up until April 2021. And what this allows us to see is the general level of compliance post-implementation. And as we can see in Faversham, Faversham actually achieved average speeds of less than 60 miles per hour during the post-implementation period, and generally there is a very high level of compliance here. If we look at the same corresponding map for Tonbridge, whilst we see still a general level of compliance post-implementation, the picture was slightly less positive. And again, with better compliance in the north than in the south. And actually, particularly in the south of Tonbridge, what we do actually see is that some speeds persist over 30 miles per hour. And so in conclusion, we can say from the telematics maps that most roads in this post-implementation period had speeds below 20 miles per hour. A small number of roads in both towns saw average speeds increase marginally, but only in Tonbridge do we have some speeds maintained at that much higher level of 30 miles per hour. And again, as we will see with the ATC results, pre-speeds were much lower in Faversham post-implementation than they were in Tonbridge. And again, underlining the importance of seeing these changes on a relative basis. And so before we move on to look at the ATC counts, it's worth just noting as well the results from the pedestrian and cycle counts. And so on the right of the screen, you can see the pedestrian cycle counts for the last count that was issued approximately 12 months after the commencement of the trial period itself. And we can see a percentage increase that's fairly positive in terms of increase in footfall, for example, both more so in Faversham, but also in Tonbridge as well. And then if we take, that was the fourth and final speed count. Sorry, not speed count, the pedestrian cyclist count. Whereas if we look at the graph on the left, we can see the second one that was issued just a couple of months after the trial had commenced. And again, conversely, you can see that the results for the level of pedestrian activity had sort of flipped, with Tonbridge having greater in that shorter time period. But what I think is interesting from this is that in the third count, which is not on this screen, and again, as with those two counts there, you can see the actual the level of cycling activity decreased in terms of percentage difference across all three of those subsequent counts, which is something to think about. And what isn't on this screen is that from the vivacity counts, generally, we took motor vehicle counts using vivacity data, and they were notably higher in Tonbridge, as were average speeds. And so again, what were the results from the automatic traffic counter data? And so, for example, if we look at Faversham first, across those 13 sites, essentially what we saw is an average reduction of almost 1 miles per hour, so 0.9 miles per hour. However, if you discount two of the 13 sites, which were the only two to experience increases, then actually that is turns into 1.8 miles per hour, which is a noteworthy speed reduction. And again, as with the telematics that I alluded to, these reductions were from a much lower pre-trial average speed of 22 miles per hour, which therefore went to 21.3 miles per hour. And in terms of the differences we saw across the 13 sites, 5 out of those 13 ATC sites had average speeds below 20 miles per hour, and 10 of them had average speeds that were below 24 miles per hour. And whereas the picture was quite different in Tonbridge, where actually none of the ATC sites had average speeds below 20 miles per hour, and only 4 had average speeds that were below 24 miles per hour. In Tonbridge, we saw the average speed reduction of 3 miles per hour, with the greatest reductions witnessed on roads which already had much higher pre-speeds. And so it's important to emphasise that whilst the reductions may seem much greater in Tonbridge, you would naturally expect this to an extent, regardless of intervention input, because greater reductions are generally experienced on roads with much higher pre-speeds, which is the case in this instance, where clearly the fastest drivers have reduced their speeds by the greatest amount. And again, just thinking about the pre-trial average, which was 22 miles per hour in Faversham, that pre-trial average was 29 miles per hour, just to put that into context. And again, it was a very similar picture in terms of what was measured for the 85th percentile speeds, just with slightly different changes in average speeds. And so for both towns, we can conclude that the speed data analysis indicates that roads with lower pre-speed showed little change, whilst roads with higher pre-speeds showed greater reductions. But in some cases, particularly in Tonbridge, these reductions were not enough to meet that intervention threshold of 24 miles per hour, where generally you would be expected to generate compliance. And so now I'm going to hand over to Momina, who is going to talk a little about the qualitative side of the data. And so over to you, Momina.
Thank you, Sam. Afternoon, everyone. I'm Momina. I'm a researcher here at Agilicis and part of the team that worked on the Kent 20-mile trial evaluation. In addition to the quantitative data that you've already heard about, There was also qualitative data collected, as well as literature reviews and analysis of previous case studies of similar trials implemented. For the purposes of this trial, there were a variety of sources collected, from consultations to behavioral surveys, which inquired on the intended and reported behavior of local residents in Faversham, Tonbridge, and the comparator town of Deal. So given behavioral surveys, there was 600 face-to-face surveys with questionnaires for each town. There was about 1,800 respondents in totals. These outputs were thematically divided into self-reported and intended behavior for drivers, pedestrians, and cyclists. The behavioral surveys found that Faversham residents were more aware of the implementation of the 20-mile-per-hour limits and have heard about them via a range of channels than those compared from Tonbridge. The differences in observed results need to be viewed in the context of different history and communicating strategies of 20 miles per hour limits in the two towns, with Faversham having a longer history of 20s plenty campaigning in the preceding years since when the experimental traffic orders were implemented. According to the surveys, walking regularly is more common already against Faversham residents than those from Tonbridge, with more of the residents using a car every day in Tonbridge, according to the survey. Walking because of COVID-19 measures increased in Faversham and Deal, while they remained the same in Tonbridge. However, over 10% of the respondents from both trial towns said that their levels of walking had increased after the 20-mile-per-hour limits were introduced, and around 20% felt that there were more walking occurring in their area. These increases in action to behavior were higher than those that were seen in other studies, like the Atkins report, which was one of the studies that was compared to. Cycling was also more common amongst Faversham residents than those from Tonbridge, with higher proportion of Tonbridge residents who stated before implementation that they never cycled. Tonbridge respondents also stated that there was no increase in cycling because of the COVID-19 measures, but nearly 10% of residents in both towns reported an increase in their level of pedal cycle activity after the 20 miles per hour limits were installed. Looking at attitudes, Faversham had higher levels of support, as mentioned before, for the 20 miles per hour limits than Tonbridge and the Deal. Opposition to the zones increased amongst Tonbridge residents post-implementation. However, residents of both towns and Deal agreed that the main benefits of local traffic initiatives are increased road safety for pedestrians and cyclists. There was also consultation evidence which was received by Kent County Council between the 31st of July 2020 and the 3rd of March 2021 on the experimental traffic orders for both the trial areas. These were completed with residents, and online consultations were conducted between July 2020 and March 2021, with responses from more than 1,100 individuals for the Tonbridge consultation and more than 650 for Faversham. The Faversham Commonplace engagement provided an opportunity for local road users to share their concerns and suggest interventions to make the town healthier, safer, and cleaner, which was one of the objectives of this trial. There was feedback on barriers to walking and cycling, air quality, and specific roads of concern, both those within and outside of the trial. Speeding was a major concern, making respondents feel unsafe. Then we looked at pre-existing research studies and historical case studies. In this case, we looked at the Bright study, which was conducted in Bristol. There was an Edinburgh one, and the Atkins report. The Atkins report was funded by DFT and is considered best practice evaluation in signed-only 20 miles per hour speed limit implementation. Evaluated schemes implemented elsewhere in the UK have also been referenced. And however, in our research, when comparing Kent results to other case studies, it was important to clarify that the results from Bristol and Edinburgh 20 miles per hour schemes were evaluated over a much longer period to measure impacts and compare results with pre-implementation. For Kent, as Jamie mentioned, the baseline as well as the post-implementation period was very short. It was an emergency measure and there was only over 1 year only, and the crash and casualty data was not yet available, which makes it difficult to gauge the long-term impact and determine if healthier and safer communities have been created as a result of the intervention. When we look at comparative changes in outputs, using the responses from the surveys, questionnaires, and consultations, we were able to gauge a better understanding of the levels of support, opposition for the trials, and the underlying attitudes and perceptions that existed. The key finding of the consultation in Faversham revealed that 63% of respondents were in favor of 20 miles per hour, while 37% objected. This is analyzing responses by transport method divided by level of support reveals support for 20 miles per hour, mostly by those that walked, at 67% compared to 56% support by car drivers. Safety was the most frequently mentioned theme by respondents, regardless of the mode of transport that they used the most. However, compared to Faversham, there was a different picture in Tonbridge, which revealed that only 26% of residents were in favor of a town-wide 20 miles per hour zone, and 74% of residents opposed the implementation. When we segregated that by road user group, 80% of respondents used a car as the driver traveling in and around Tonbridge. Walking on foot was the next most relevant mode of transport. And then when we analyzed negative comments by themes, the largest proportion of comments were concerns against blanket implementation of 20 miles per hour limits. Slowing traffic flow and congestion was the second most frequent theme. Other comments included lack of enforcement and/or limit being ignored and difficulty to drive. There were concerns about worsening congestion from slower speeds, safety concerns, and the impracticability of enforcement. The following results should be read, noting that not all respondents supported the reductions. Oh, can somebody change the slide, please? Thank you. We will just look at some trial parameters and wider considerations that were of the trials informed from best practice and the Kent County Council trial. So the ongoing commitment of appropriate data collection is really important if you want to implement any such traffic order. Preparing engagement plans and communication strategy is also important, but appropriate data collection during all stages of the trial, whether that's speeds on selected roads and resident surveys, all collectively need to be designed in the intervention so baseline data can be compared from pre-intervention, during, and post-intervention. This is critical because we're having to have the most applicable and effective use of data so valuable insights can be drawn. This also paves the way for building a repository of evidence that is useful for evaluations and information that is critical in best practice knowledge for the sector. We also want to, when designing trials, understand the aims of the intervention and the focus. So this is important because in interpreting results and designing the stages, whether that is if your aim is to increase active travel in proportion to resident journeys, whether that's walking and cycling activity, whether that's reducing congestion, reducing overall KSIs, and various other aims to be put in perspective when designing interventions and monitor results for optimum impact. One important thing that came across in the literature that we studied, especially the BRIGHT study in Bristol, was the emphasis that the measure of success of was not being defined by all average speeds being below the set speed limit of 20 miles per hour, but bringing vehicle speeds down closer to 20 miles per hour, which is in line with the quantitative results that Sam has just shared with you, that speeds overall did decrease. And assessing the positive impacts of speed reduction compared to the situation before. This matches the findings as mentioned, and if your speeds are already going to be higher in the pre-implementation, the reduction would also be compared to if some place like Faversham already had lower speed limits, so the average speed reduction would be low as well. A geographical road-by-road review is important, whether that's understanding that separate localities and towns are to be the design of them can influence compliance with lower speed limits and the modal choice of residents. While it is not in the scope of this study to analyze the geographies of each town, it should be noted that road layouts, infrastructure, active travel facilities, and the main journey purpose of specific routes will influence the levels of walking and cycling and adherence to 20 miles per hour limits. This can obviously depend on the quality of road infrastructure and the supporting design and land use planning, amongst other factors, which could influence the propensity and preference of residents to cycle, walk, and drive. If the available infrastructure and routes between the amenities is less conducive to walking and cycling, it will be harder to encourage residents to switch from the car. This would also make the reduction to 20 miles per hour less palatable because it can be seen as an inconvenience rather than enabling safer journeys. Thank you. I will now hand it over back to Sam for the general recommendations.
Thanks, Momina. And yes, we're just going to briefly discuss some of the general recommendations, of course, some of which are relevant to any local authority looking to either implement or improve 20 miles per hour limit schemes, particularly those with that are signed only and with little or no associated infrastructure. And so thinking about pre-engagement and campaigning, Complementary activities and campaigning, like we've seen in Faversham, should be adopted in order to achieve that greater support and early buy-in. And again, there was a key enforcement remains a key concern, and shifting that narrative onto positive compliance and the actual benefits of the schemes themselves in a holistic manner, that should be adopted, and to really get generate momentum in that shift in messaging. Yeah, also road by road reviews should be undertaken where 20 miles per hour is effective and where more engagement is needed. But overall, from the quant analysis plus the qualitative analysis, given the moderate speed reductions coupled with small but significant self-reported uptake in active travel modes, this does suggest retaining the limits and the zones in both towns, with an assessment, of course, of where compliance was not achieved, which in this instance means where average speeds maintained above 24 miles per hour. Those, of course, should be looked at. And again, sustained public engagement through tailored social marketing and multimedia alongside integrated policies for such schemes are more likely to improve outcomes moving forward. So thanks, and I will hand back.
Right. So I think, Jamie, was just a sort of one last slide from you, just about where Kent is going next, sort of lessons learned and the way forward, or we jump to questions. So back to you, Jamie.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to reiterate what's just been said, actually, mostly, but I just wanted to give a feel of the procedures as well that we have to go through at the end for the completion of the trial. We report in Kent to a joint transportation board, which is a board that's made up of both the Kent County Council and the local borough council, in this case Swale Borough Council for Faversham and Tonbridge and Malling Borough Council for the Tonbridge town. They then make a recommendation to the KCC Cabinet Member for Highways, who ultimately has is the decision maker. So we took the reports back, and Faversham agreed wholeheartedly to keep all of the 20 mile per hour limit, the extents as is, and Tonbridge and Malling wished to revert the main roads, the arterial roads into the town, back to 30. The main roads were seeing reductions in speeds, but it did give the most amount of concern for the board to make those recommendations to keep the 30. And really the way forward, or to implement a successful large area with minimum engineering, is important at the earliest stage, and I can't reiterate this enough, to promote the changes and the reasoning for this, ideally months before you even think about putting signs and lines or traffic calming measures to the residents and the businesses. It's not always necessary to include the cul-de-sacs. Quite often they're their own little area, which doesn't need to have signs and lines plastered everywhere. Main roads with average speeds in the high 20s to early 30s do need additional measures, although Tonbridge did see quite a reduction in speeds. It wasn't sufficient to bring it into a 20 mile per hour. Actually trying to provide sensible traffic calming measures on roads that need to take HGVs and buses and larger vehicles is quite difficult to have. And the enforcement bit, it came up quite a bit on why aren't the police enforcing the 20s, and we're working quite a lot with Kent Police to try and understand how they can help with the enforcement, and that really their stance is they won't enforce it unless it's self-enforcing. However, what we're trying to do, they're starting to help out by saying they will investigate, but if it's deemed that it's difficult to comply with, they'll probably throw it back to the local authority or highway authority to do more campaigning and more maybe some additional measures to try and bring the speeds down, rather than absolutely go for the PCNs and start fining people. But we are getting there, I must say. We're working well with them. Involve the community as early on as possible. It's them that have to live there, deal with it. They can help with the compliance quite well if they support it. And maybe think about introducing cycle facilities and walking facilities at the same time as you introduce lower speed limits, and it all sort of gels and makes sense that there's a bigger picture there. And hopefully they can all start doing their local cycling and walking infrastructure plans, which in Kent is moving on really well. Majority of our councils now have them, and we're looking at a Kent-wide LC whip to help the strategy of those. And probably lastly, I'll leave you with there is a high demand in Kent for 20s, so they're not going to go away. So we need to work out and still do some more investigation on how best we can deliver the environment that our residents and councillors are saying they want. So yes, thank you for that.
Brilliant, Jamie. That's super. Thank you to Sam and Momina for sharing the results of that. So, needless to say, with 110 odd people who've joined in this afternoon, there's been plenty of discussion and lots of questions asked. So I'm going to try and get us through, sort of quite a few of those in the next 10 minutes or so, and see how many we get through. Jamie, I know you've answered this in chat, but for those who haven't necessarily kind of engaged with chat, one of the questions that Duncan asked was around 20-mile-an-hour zones or limits. I think you intimated that you applied different measures in different places. So what did you do in Faversham and Tonbridge? What was different, and why did you choose the different approaches in each place?
Well, pretty much, if I start with Tonbridge. Tonbridge already had some 20-mile-per-hour zones in the town centre, so it made sense to just extend the zones. That was fairly straightforward. And Faversham had, at the heart of the town, the market town, they had some speed limits. So it was just a sort of a natural thing to follow on what had already been there. And as I believe was put in the chats, it is quite a grey area between the zones and the limits. So we were only ever going to look at road markings and signing. But a lot of the facilities that were already there, whether they're parked cars or junctions or centre islands, to help probably reinforce the zone element of where it may have been lacking a little bit.
Great. Now, I'm in slight trepidation about falling down the experimental traffic order hole that's been discussed in chat, and maybe by the sounds of it, at some point we ought to run a webinar support group for people dealing with traffic orders. But do you want to just tackle what you did in Kent in terms of what traffic orders you used? But I think you already touched on it, that you went experimental for the first 6 months in order to get yourselves into a position where you could consult on longer measures. But yeah, I wonder whether you could just expand a little bit on the steps that you took there.
This all came down to the timing, which may not be the right thing to do, but because we had so quick a short period of time to implement, we made a decision to use experimental traffic order. Rightly or wrongly, I'll have to take further advice of whether that was the correct way legally, but that's the way it was done, and that really allowed us to put all the facilities in and then consult at the same time, rather than waiting for the consultation, taking a report, and then making decisions on whether it's implemented. We felt that was the only possible way, with the funding available and the short timescales, to use experimental order. But I will certainly be taking advice to make sure that we've done it correctly.
Right. Well, yeah. So as I say, there's probably a support group or something that we ought to get going on that. Momina, I was going to push a question in your direction if I could. So Tim asked about whether the majority of the social media comments were negative. Obviously, you kind of looked a little bit at the qualitative analysis around this and the views of different communities. And I was wondering whether you could just sort of say a little bit more about what you thought you were seeing in terms of levels of positivity or negativity in the comments that were coming back through the different sort of mechanisms that were being used for capturing feedback from communities?
Sure. So as Jamie mentioned, there was loads of newsletters, there was social media posts, there was consultations, there was surveys, there's questionnaires. We saw that the most negative comments came from Facebook posts pre-implementation of the trials, both in Tonbridge and Faversham. And then they sort of like, as the social media posts went live, the comments used to increase and there used to be negative comments. And then as time went on and the trials were implemented, the comments sort of wavered off. But yes, mostly in terms of when we did thematic analysis of comments, the negative comments were mostly on Facebook pre-implementation of the trial.
Dan, perhaps I could just jump in there as well.
Yeah, please do.
It was, probably not surprising that when we did do a campaign, whether it's Facebook, but generally it was Facebook that brought the negative comments, sort of encouraged the negative comments. So yes, it's quite interesting on that feedback to the point on whether it influenced us actually putting out the messages, knowing that it encouraged the more negative responses. So we need to think carefully. It's not about collecting positive or negative, but it did seem to influence the more negative responses.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, just sort of reflecting on some of my own experiences in delivering safety messages when you're introducing new enforcement, for example, you've always got that point of tension around the implementation of a new measure, a new camera site, new speed limit, in whatever. But I think what we have seen with, similar measures at other times is that over a period, what you get is this understanding of the value that that's bringing to a community. And so I think, Momina, I'm right in saying that, the data you reported after the implementation in Faversham was quite highly positive about the changes once they'd been implemented.
Yeah, so when the questions were asked about what you perceive, whether Faversham is safer, healthier, after the 20 miles, but those were all positive. It was just the open text sort of comments where it's just like, if there's anything else you'd want to say, that's where the negative comments came in. But when we measured sort of pre and post, it was generally positive in Faversham. Yeah.
Right. So we've had some questions then about the potential for enforcement, and again, Jamie, when you addressed some of this in your final slide to indicate that the conversation is ongoing with Kent Police. I guess I wonder whether I could therefore sort of frame it slightly differently. I mean, what do you think the sort of long-term aim might be in terms of self-enforcing versus the requirement for enforcement? Where do you think Kent might end up in terms of an ideal situation for ensuring compliance with the limits in a kind of long-term ongoing way?
Yeah, it is a tricky one, and it was one that was brought up right at the start on, are the 20 mile per hour going to be enforced? Now, ideally, they should all be self-enforcing, but I think if we get the things done in the right order, the stages right, by educating, first of all, trying to change behaviours through safety campaigns, then introducing sensible changes and in putting the 20s where they likely stand a chance of being compliant, then we'll deal with by far the majority of road users. And then, as we all know, the 15% we're probably going to struggle with anyway. And the enforcement bit, I don't think the police will not enforce. They just need to, obviously they've got scarce resources and need to allocate them where they feel it's best needed. But I think they will help us, but it's going to have to be a team effort, and they're not quick to go and find people. They want us to work maybe a little bit harder on campaigns and maybe additional measures. So we've got to look to be even more innovative where we can, maybe a little bit braver in some areas, and just get the road feeling like it should be 20 rather than any higher speed limits. But that is harder on the distributor or arterial roads where we've got to keep certain road widths and keep traffic flowing as best we can. So I just think a more combined effort working with the educators and the enforcers and the local authorities. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's classically sometimes been that sort of binary, non-compliant, enforce, compliant, oh, it's okay then, isn't it? Whereas developing scales of measures and scales of interventions, whether it's things like community speed watch or increased signing or increased physical measures and greater communications and community engagement. I mean, it does require a toolbox of measures for us to get compliance on the network. Absolutely. Sam, there was a question that I was going to bounce in your direction, if I could, which was about the cyclist figures which dropped in the charts where you the slide where you showed the charts. Now, my instinct is that what you were seeing there in terms of decline in cycling was the effect of coming out of lockdown. So lockdown cycling figures being very high and then a tail off afterwards. Is that right? Or is there anything else that we're seeing in the data there?
Yes, I definitely agree that when it comes to the red use accounts that were issued in this instance, of course, it's very hard, isn't it, often to draw those links of causation directly between the implementation of the schemes themselves and increases or should I say, and decreases in cyclist counts. But what I thought was interesting was the disparity between levels of footfall across those 3 subsequent count surveys that were issued by PMRS with cyclists, and clearly that's something that requires further attention and further insight to look at why we saw consistent percentage increases across each of those 3 subsequent counts, and why didn't we see that with the cyclist ones, for example. And we know that things such as cycling infrastructure requires lots and lots of consultation.
Yeah, no, that is interesting, isn't it? That, pedestrian footfall continued to increase and stay at high levels, but a bit of a tail off in the cycling. So, Jamie, was there anything you wanted to comment on that, or is that?
Well, other than it was obviously a very unusual period to undertake a trial, but that was the task given to us. So all the data, it's just a really difficult time for, it wouldn't be a standard trial period, I should say. Yeah.
No, indeed. Okay, well, I'm conscious that we're sort of drawing towards the end of our time. There's been a huge amount in there, and it would be great to be able to sort of get back to some more questions. I wanted to ask one more question quickly of each of you. This was actually Ryan who raised this in the chat about your thoughts on whether England's likely to go for a default 20-mile-an-hour limit the way that Wales is. So just interested in any of your views on that. Anyone want to offer a view on whether we're likely to get it on this side of the border?
Yeah, it's something that with our new developments coming on board, although they're designed at 20, the speed limits we don't put in at 20, they're still 30. But it would be far easier, I think, if streetlights meant 20 or something like that. So I think this needs to be a national campaign if that's what professionals wish to see. But I'm not sure we're there in the next few years.
I think I probably agree with Tim, who's just put in chat that central government hasn't got the guts. I think there doesn't feel like there's the motivation at the moment centrally to lead on that. Great. Well, look, we as I say, we're knocking on the end of our time. Steve has put a link to the report in the chat. This recording of this webinar will be available to you afterwards if you want to share that with colleagues and get others to engage with it. I just want to say a huge thank you to all of you who participated this afternoon. Fantastic to have well over 100 people engaged in this conversation and taking a look at the evidence here. So thank you very much for joining us. And also just want to say a big thank you to Jamie, to Momina and Sam for their contribution to this session. This is the end of our little webinar series for June, but I'm sure that there will be plenty of appetite for us to do some other sessions at some point in the future. So hopefully there'll be some further sessions not too far away. But for now, let me just say thank you ever so for joining us. Stay safe out there, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks very much.